My girlfriend's father cornered me in the parking lot after dinner. He said, "Leave her now or I'll make sure you lose everything." I was standing next to my Toyota in the dimly lit parking lot behind Romano's Steakhouse when Richard Thornton stepped out from between two SUVs and blocked my path to the driver's door. The restaurant's outdoor lights cast his face in harsh shadows that made him look older than his 58 years. His hand was in his jacket pocket, and for one surreal moment, I thought he might actually pull out a weapon. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen twice, and turned it toward me. The photo showed me entering a hotel at 3:15 p.m. on a Wednesday 2 weeks ago. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner. My stomach dropped because I recognized the hotel, and I knew exactly what Richard thought that photo proved. Except he was completely, catastrophically wrong about what I'd been doing there. He smiled without any warmth reaching his eyes and said in a voice so calm it was terrifying that I had exactly 24 hours to break up with his daughter Natalie, or he'd send this photo and 19 others like it to my employer, my family, and every person in my professional network, along with a detailed story about my alleged affair. He said he'd systematically destroy my career, my reputation, and any chance I had at a future in this city. Then he walked away before I could say a single word in my defense. I'd been dating Natalie for 14 months when her father decided to end our relationship by any means necessary. We met at a medical conference in Chicago, where I was presenting research on pediatric cardiology and she was covering the event for a healthcare publication. She approached me after my presentation with intelligent questions about my methodology and a smile that made me forget what I was going to say next. We talked for 3 hours over coffee that afternoon, then dinner that evening, then breakfast the next morning. By the time the conference ended, we'd exchanged numbers and made plans to see each other again, despite living in the same city and somehow never crossing paths before. She was 29, a senior medical writer with ambitions of starting her own healthcare communications firm. I was 32, a cardiac surgeon who'd completed my fellowship the previous year and was building my practice. We fit together easily in ways that felt rare and worth protecting. The first 6 months were uncomplicated and happy. Natalie was sharp and funny, passionate about her work, but not defined by it, close with her family but independent. I met her parents for the first time at a charity gala her father's company was sponsoring. Richard Thornton owned Thornton Medical Supply, a distribution business worth approximately $40 million that he'd built over 30 years. He was polished and charming at the gala, asking about my surgical work with apparent genuine interest, making jokes that landed well, treating me like a welcomed addition to their family circle. His wife, Eleanor, was quieter but warm, a retired teacher who clearly adored Natalie. I left that evening thinking I'd been fortunate to find a woman with a solid family foundation who welcomed me readily into their lives. I was so completely wrong about what Richard Thornton actually wanted. The first crack in the facade appeared around month 7, when Natalie mentioned casually that her father had asked detailed questions about my finances. She said he'd wanted to know about my student loan debt, my salary, my investment strategy, and whether I had family money. I laughed it off as normal parental concern about their daughter's partner's stability, but Natalie's expression was troubled when she said her father had never done this with previous boyfriends. She said Richard was acting strange about our relationship in ways she couldn't quite articulate, asking her if she was sure I was the right fit for her, suggesting she might want to keep dating other people instead of getting serious so young. I told her parents worried, and that was normal, that he'd probably warm up once he got to know me better. I suggested we spend more time with her family to build that rapport. Looking back, that was exactly the wrong strategy. The family dinners became a monthly obligation that I initially welcomed and gradually began to dread. Richard would ask probing questions about my practice, my patients, my research interests, and my career trajectory. On the surface, it seemed like professional curiosity from a successful businessman interested in his daughter's partner's work. But there was an edge to his inquiries that felt more like an interrogation than conversation. He'd ask how many surgeries I performed weekly, what my success rates were, whether I'd had any malpractice concerns, what my 5-year plan looked like. He'd make comments about the demanding nature of surgical careers and how it affected family life, how surgeons notoriously had high divorce rates and struggled with work-life balance. Natalie would try to redirect the conversation, but Richard always steered it back to cataloging my perceived shortcomings. The shift from subtle disapproval to active sabotage started in month 10. Natalie told me her father had hired a private investigator to conduct a background check on me. She'd found the invoice in his home office and confronted him, and he'd admitted it without shame, saying any good father would want to ensure his daughter wasn't being deceived by someone with secrets. The investigation had turned up nothing because I had nothing to hide, but the violation of privacy was staggering. I asked Natalie if she wanted me to talk to Richard directly, and she said absolutely not, that her father was stubborn and confrontation would only make him dig in harder. She said she'd handle it, that she'd made it clear his behavior was unacceptable, and he'd promised to back off. He didn't back off. He just got more strategic. Richard started appearing at places where Natalie and I would be. A restaurant where we had reservations, a wine bar we frequented, a park where we walked on Sunday mornings. Each time, he'd act surprised to see us, claim coincidence, join us for a few minutes of conversation that always included some subtle dig at my profession or personality. Natalie was increasingly frustrated, having multiple heated conversations with her father about boundaries and respect. Richard would apologize, promise to give us space, then show up again the following week. I started to feel hunted in my own city, constantly scanning crowds for Richard's face, wondering if any outing with Natalie would be interrupted by her father's manufactured coincidences. The incidents escalated through month 11 and 12. Richard sent Natalie articles about surgeon burnout and medical errors, always with a note saying he was just concerned about her future with someone in such a high-stress profession. He called her late at night to share stories he'd heard about surgeons who'd cracked under pressure or made fatal mistakes in the operating room. He offered to introduce her to other men, successful businessmen or lawyers or consultants, who had better work-life balance than a cardiac surgeon could provide. Natalie shut down every attempt, told her father repeatedly that she loved me, and his interference needed to stop. Her mother Eleanor tried to mediate, suggesting Richard see a therapist about his controlling behavior, but he dismissed her concerns and said he was simply being a protective parent. Then came the photos. Over a 2-week period in month 13, someone followed me and documented my movements. I didn't notice at the time because I was focused on work and my relationship, not watching for surveillance. The photos showed me at various locations around the city, going about my normal routine. Several showed me entering and exiting the Grandview Hotel on the west side. What the photos didn't show was why I was there or what I was doing inside. That context would have destroyed Richard's entire theory, but he'd constructed a narrative before seeking the truth, and the narrative fit his agenda perfectly. He'd convinced himself I was having an affair, and he was going to use that manufactured evidence to force me away from his daughter. Standing in that parking lot with Richard's ultimatum hanging in the air, I felt my hands go numb around my car keys. 24 hours. The timeline was deliberately short, designed to prevent me from mounting any effective defense. I could tell Natalie what her father had done, but without explaining why I'd been at that hotel, the photos looked damning. I could refuse to break up with her and let Richard follow through on his threats, destroying my professional reputation with fabricated allegations of infidelity. Or I could comply with his demands and walk away from the best relationship I'd ever had to protect my career. Every option was a trap. Richard had made sure of that. I drove home in a daze and sat in my apartment staring at my phone for an hour before calling the one person who might understand the full situation. Doctor. Marcus Shepard was my mentor from fellowship, a cardiac surgeon with 32 years of experience who'd guided me through the most challenging cases of my training. He was also the reason I'd been at the Grandview Hotel. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice concerned when I asked if we could meet immediately. We sat in his home office at 10:30 that night while I explained everything, and he listened with the same patient attention he brought to complex surgical consultations. When I finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Richard Thornton had made a catastrophic error in judgment, and we needed to handle this carefully to protect both my career and Natalie's well-being. He asked if I'd told Natalie why I'd been at the hotel, and I admitted I hadn't, because I'd promised to keep the situation confidential until it was resolved. Marcus said confidentiality was important, but not at the cost of my relationship or professional reputation. He said he'd support whatever I decided to do, but he thought I needed to tell Natalie the truth and let her confront her father with the reality of his accusations. I said I was worried about violating patient privacy, and Marcus reminded me gently that the patient in question had given explicit permission for me to share information with people who needed to know. Permission I'd been too cautious to exercise until forced into this corner. The patient was Richard Thornton's own brother, Jeffrey Thornton, who'd been diagnosed with severe coronary artery disease 6 weeks earlier. Jeffrey had specifically requested I not tell his brother about his condition because their relationship was strained, and he didn't want Richard's interference in his medical care. He'd been staying at the Grandview Hotel for the past month because it was close to the hospital, and he didn't want to burden his own family with his illness. I'd been visiting him there for consultations because he was too weak for outpatient appointments and unwilling to be admitted until absolutely necessary. The photos Richard had taken showed me providing medical care to his own brother, while Jeffrey explicitly requested confidentiality from family. The irony was so bitter, I could taste it. I called Natalie at 6:30 the next morning and asked if we could meet for breakfast before I went to the hospital. She heard something in my voice and said she'd come to my apartment immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later with coffee and concern, and I told her everything. About her father cornering me in the parking lot, about the photos and the ultimatum, about why I'd actually been at the Grandview Hotel and why I couldn't tell her before now. I showed her the text messages from Jeffrey confirming our appointments, the medical notes documenting his condition, the written permission he'd given me to disclose his information if the need arose. Natalie sat on my couch absorbing all of this, her face cycling through shock and anger and something that looked like grief. She asked if her uncle was going to be okay, and I said his prognosis was uncertain, but we had surgical options that could significantly extend his life and improve his quality of living. She asked why Jeffrey hadn't told the family, and I said he'd mentioned a falling out with Richard years ago over business decisions, and had made it clear he didn't trust his brother to respect his wishes about his medical care. Natalie nodded slowly and said that tracked with things she'd observed but never fully understood about her father and uncle's relationship. Then she looked at me with steel in her eyes and said we were going to her parents' house immediately to confront Richard with the truth. The drive to the Thornton estate took 35 minutes, and Natalie called her mother on the way to ensure both parents would be home. Eleanor answered, sounding surprised by the early call, and Natalie said simply that we needed to have a family conversation about Richard's behavior, and it couldn't wait. Eleanor's voice shifted to concern, but she agreed we should come over. We pulled up to the sprawling Tudor-style house at 8:15 a.m., and Richard's black Lexus was in the driveway. My stomach was tight with anticipation of the confrontation ahead, but Natalie's expression was determined as we walked to the front door together. Eleanor opened the door looking worried, and Richard appeared behind her in the foyer, looking irritated at the interruption to his morning routine. Natalie walked past both of them into the formal living room and turned to face her father with her arms crossed. She asked Richard to explain why he'd threatened her boyfriend in a parking lot last night, and the color drained from Eleanor's face while Richard's expression shifted to calculated innocence. He said he'd simply had a conversation with me about relationship expectations, and perhaps I'd misunderstood his tone. Natalie pulled out her phone and said she'd like him to explain the photos then, and Richard's mask slipped slightly before he recovered. He said he'd been concerned about my behavior and hired someone to document it for Natalie's protection. He said the photos spoke for themselves and showed a pattern of deception that proved I wasn't trustworthy. Natalie asked if he'd bothered to ask me what I was doing at that hotel before constructing his elaborate theory. Richard said my activities were self-evident, and he wasn't going to insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. That's when Natalie told him I'd been treating his own brother Jeffrey for advanced heart disease at Jeffrey's explicit request, and the photos showed me making house calls to a patient too ill to come to my office. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's face went from confident to confused to something that might have been horror as he processed what Natalie had said. Eleanor made a small sound and asked if Jeffrey was dying, and I said carefully that he had serious cardiac issues that required intervention, but he could have years of quality life with proper treatment. Richard asked why Jeffrey hadn't told the family, and Natalie said coldly that he'd specifically requested medical confidentiality from his brother, which should tell Richard everything he needed to know about their relationship. She asked how many other times Richard had jumped to conclusions and tried to control her life based on incomplete information and his own paranoia. Richard attempted to recover, saying he'd been acting in Natalie's best interest and couldn't have known about Jeffrey's situation. Natalie cut him off and said his behavior had nothing to do with her best interest and everything to do with his need for control. She said he'd hired investigators, stalked us at restaurants, sent disturbing articles, and now threatened to destroy my career based on photos he'd deliberately misinterpreted. She said his actions weren't protective parenting, but obsessive control, and she was done tolerating it. Richard tried to speak, and Natalie raised her voice over him, saying she was moving forward with her relationship with me whether he approved or not, and if he continued this pattern of interference, she'd cut him out of her life entirely. Eleanor was crying quietly, and Richard looked like he'd been physically struck. He said weakly that he was just trying to protect her from making a mistake, and Natalie said the only mistake was trusting him to respect her as an adult capable of making her own choices. She said we were leaving, and he needed to seriously examine his behavior because it was destroying their relationship. We walked out while Richard stood frozen in the living room, and Eleanor followed us to the door, asking Natalie to please not cut them off entirely, that she'd talk to Richard and try to make him understand how far he'd gone. The aftermath played out over the following weeks in ways that surprised me. Richard called me directly 3 days after our confrontation and asked if we could meet privately. I agreed cautiously and met him at a neutral coffee shop downtown. He looked diminished somehow, older and less certain than I'd ever seen him. He apologized for the photos and the threats and the months of interference, said he'd been struggling with the reality that Natalie was building a life separate from the family he'd constructed for her. He said watching her get serious with someone meant accepting he was no longer the central male figure in her life, and he'd handled that transition catastrophically. He asked if there was any way to repair the damage he'd caused. I told Richard honestly that the apology was appreciated, but the trust was broken. I said I understood parental protective instincts, but he'd crossed multiple lines into harassment and attempted sabotage of both my career and his own brother's medical privacy. I said any relationship going forward would need to include firm boundaries and professional therapy to address his controlling behavior. Richard nodded and said Eleanor had already found him a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and control issues, and he'd committed to weekly sessions. He asked if I'd be willing to attend family therapy together once he'd made progress individually, and I said I'd consider it if Natalie wanted that. The revelation about Jeffrey's illness forced Richard to confront his estranged relationship with his brother as well. Jeffrey had given me permission to share his diagnosis with the family after Richard's parking lot ambush, recognizing that the truth needed to come out to prevent further damage. Richard visited his brother at the Grandview Hotel for the first time in 8 years, and according to Jeffrey, they had a difficult but necessary conversation about old grievances and Richard's pattern of trying to control everyone around him. Jeffrey agreed to let Richard be involved in his medical care going forward, but with explicit boundaries about decision-making and respect for Jeffrey's autonomy. I performed Jeffrey's coronary bypass surgery 6 weeks after the parking lot incident. The procedure went well, and his recovery progressed better than we'd initially projected. Richard attended every update meeting with appropriate questions and visible concern for his brother, a marked change from the controlling behavior he'd displayed toward Natalie and me. Eleanor told Natalie privately that the therapy was helping, that Richard was beginning to recognize patterns in his behavior that had damaged multiple relationships over the years. She said he'd always been controlling, but it had intensified after Natalie started getting serious with partners, triggered by fear of losing his daughter rather than any actual deficiency in the men she chose. Natalie and I continued our relationship with clearer boundaries around family involvement. We moved in together 5 months after the parking lot confrontation, a decision we made independently and announced to both families after the fact rather than seeking approval. Richard's reaction was measured support rather than interference, acknowledging that we were adults making our own choices. He sent a housewarming gift with a note apologizing again for his past behavior and expressing hope that we could build a healthier relationship going forward. Natalie said it was progress, even if the damage from his earlier actions would take years to fully heal. The really unexpected development came 7 months after everything exploded. I was at the hospital reviewing surgical schedules when I got a call from Detective Laura Simmons with the city's fraud division. She'd been a detective for 19 years and had a reputation for thorough investigations. She asked if I had time to discuss Richard Thornton and some concerning information that had emerged during an unrelated investigation. I said I'd come to the station during my lunch break, my mind racing through what Richard might have done that would attract police attention. Detective Simmons met me in an interview room and explained that the fraud division had been investigating Thornton Medical Supply for potential Medicare fraud and illegal kickback schemes. During their investigation of company financial records, they'd discovered Richard had paid a private investigator named Derek Lansing over $15,000 during the period he was surveilling me. Lansing had been flagged in their system because he'd previously been involved in corporate espionage cases and had a history of using illegal methods to gather information. Detective Simmons asked what my relationship with Richard Thornton was and why he might have hired Lansing to investigate me. I explained the situation carefully, including the photos and threats and Richard's subsequent apology and therapy. Detective Simmons took notes and asked if I'd kept any documentation of Richard's threats or Lansing's surveillance. I said I hadn't, because I'd been focused on resolving the situation privately rather than pursuing legal action. She nodded and said the investigation into Thornton Medical Supply was ongoing, but she wanted me to be aware that Lansing's methods sometimes included illegal wiretapping and computer hacking. She said I should check my devices and accounts for any signs of unauthorized access, and if I found anything, to contact her immediately. I left the police station with a new appreciation for how badly Richard's obsession could have gone. That evening, I hired a cybersecurity consultant named Trevor Yang, who specialized in detecting surveillance software and unauthorized access. He'd been working in cybersecurity for 14 years and had contracts with several major corporations. Trevor spent 6 hours examining my laptop, phone, and home network. He found spyware on my laptop that had been installed approximately 9 months earlier, during the period when Richard's interference was escalating. The software had been logging my keystrokes, screenshots, and browsing history, sending everything to an external server. Trevor documented everything carefully and said I should absolutely report this to Detective Simmons because unauthorized computer access was a federal crime. I called Natalie before contacting the police and told her what Trevor had found. She was silent for a long moment before saying she needed to confront her father about this directly. I said the police were already investigating him for other issues, and this would likely make everything worse. She said she understood, but she needed to know if Richard had known about the spyware or if Lansing had installed it without his knowledge. She said the difference mattered because one scenario was obsessive control and the other was criminal conspiracy. I said I'd support whatever she decided to do, but she should prepare for the possibility that her father had known exactly what he was authorizing. Natalie went to her parents' house that evening without me and had a 3-hour conversation with Richard that she later described as the most difficult of her life. Richard initially denied knowing about any spyware, then admitted Lansing had told him he could access my digital communications for an additional fee. Richard claimed he'd said no to that option, but Lansing must have done it anyway. Natalie said she didn't believe him, that the timeline of the spyware installation matched when Richard's interference had escalated, which suggested he'd been reading my private communications and using that information to plan his sabotage strategy. Richard broke down and admitted he'd been receiving weekly reports from Lansing that included my emails, text messages, and search history. He'd been looking for evidence of infidelity or financial problems or anything he could use to prove I wasn't right for Natalie. The violation was so profound that Natalie told her father she needed a complete break from their relationship while she processed what he'd done. She said the therapy and apologies had seemed genuine, but this revelation showed a level of invasion that went beyond controlling behavior into criminal stalking. She said she'd be cooperating with Detective Simmons' investigation, and Richard should get a criminal defense attorney immediately. Richard begged her not to talk to the police, said it would destroy the family business and their reputation. Natalie said he should have thought about that before he authorized illegal surveillance of her boyfriend. She walked out and hasn't spoken to him since beyond necessary legal communications. Detective Simmons was very interested in the spyware evidence. She obtained a warrant for Lansing's files and found documentation of his work for Richard, including contracts that explicitly mentioned electronic surveillance and data collection. The evidence showed Richard had paid for comprehensive monitoring of my activities for 8 months, receiving detailed reports about my communications, movements, and personal life. Lansing had also surveilled several of Richard's business competitors and a former employee who'd threatened to report Medicare fraud, which connected back to the original investigation that had brought Richard to police attention. The district attorney, Patricia Henley, who'd been prosecuting white-collar crime for 23 years, decided to pursue charges against both Richard and Lansing. Richard was charged with conspiracy to commit computer fraud, illegal wiretapping, and stalking. Lansing faced additional charges related to his surveillance of Richard's business rivals and the former employee. The case attracted significant media attention because Richard was a prominent businessman, and the details of his obsessive surveillance of his daughter's boyfriend made for compelling headlines. The coverage destroyed Richard's reputation in the business community and led several hospital systems to suspend their contracts with Thornton Medical Supply, pending the outcome of the criminal case. The trial happened 8 months after Detective Simmons first contacted me. I testified about the parking lot confrontation, the threats, and the timeline of Richard's interference in my relationship with Natalie. Trevor Yang testified about the spyware and the data it had collected. Derek Lansing, facing decades in prison on multiple counts, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and testified in detail about Richard's instructions to monitor me and gather any information that could be used to force me away from Natalie. Lansing's testimony was devastating because he had recordings of his conversations with Richard, where Richard explicitly asked for access to my private communications and expressed hope they'd find evidence of behavior Natalie would find unforgivable. Natalie didn't attend the trial, but gave a victim impact statement that was read in court during sentencing. She described the psychological damage from learning her father had violated her boyfriend's privacy so egregiously, the betrayal of trust that had destroyed their relationship, and the ongoing fear that Richard might target future partners if he couldn't accept her choices. She said her father's actions had taught her that love without respect for autonomy was control, and control taken to extremes became abuse. The judge, the Honorable Evelyn Frost, who'd been on the bench for 16 years, read Natalie's statement aloud and then delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of Richard's crimes. Richard received 3 years in federal prison for the conspiracy and computer fraud charges, plus 2 years of supervised probation after release. He was ordered to pay restitution to me for the cybersecurity investigation and potential career damage, a sum of $85,000 that his attorney tried unsuccessfully to reduce. The judge said Richard had abused his wealth and resources to stalk and terrorize someone his daughter loved, and the sentence needed to reflect both the criminal nature of his actions and the profound violation of trust. Lansing received 5 years for his role in multiple surveillance operations and his history of similar illegal activities. The aftermath reshaped Natalie's entire family structure. Eleanor filed for divorce 3 weeks after Richard's sentencing, saying she couldn't remain married to someone capable of such invasive control and criminal behavior. She'd spent their entire marriage making excuses for Richard's intensity and need to control situations, but the trial had forced her to confront the reality that his behavior had progressed from concerning to criminal. She reached out to Natalie and me and apologized for not seeing how bad things had gotten, for not standing up to Richard earlier when his interference was escalating. She said she'd enabled his worst impulses by staying silent, and she was committed to building healthier relationships with her daughter and brother-in-law going forward. Jeffrey's recovery continued steadily, and he developed an unexpectedly close relationship with Natalie during Richard's trial and imprisonment. Jeffrey said watching his brother's obsessive control destroy his relationship with Natalie had clarified why he'd distanced himself from Richard years earlier. He said Richard had tried to control his business decisions, his marriage, his medical care, every aspect of his life, until Jeffrey had finally cut ties to preserve his own autonomy. He'd reconnected only because his illness required family support, but he'd set firm boundaries that Richard had actually managed to respect once forced to confront his own behavior. Jeffrey said he hoped prison would give Richard time to genuinely change, but he wasn't optimistic based on decades of observing his brother's patterns. Thornton Medical Supply collapsed during Richard's imprisonment. The Medicare fraud investigation uncovered systematic billing irregularities and kickback schemes that predated the surveillance charges. The company filed for bankruptcy, and its assets were sold to pay restitution to defrauded government programs and settle civil lawsuits. Eleanor lost much of the wealth she'd expected from the divorce settlement, but she said the financial loss was worth the emotional freedom from Richard's control. She moved into a modest condo, returned to teaching part-time, and rebuilt her life around relationships rather than status. She told Natalie she should have left Richard years ago when his controlling behavior first became evident, but she'd been socialized to accept that men like Richard were just naturally dominant, and that wasn't necessarily wrong. The trial had shattered that conditioning. Natalie and I got married 2 years after the parking lot confrontation, a small ceremony with close friends and family that deliberately excluded Richard, even though he'd been released to a halfway house by then. Eleanor attended and gave a toast about resilience and choosing love over control that made several people cry. Jeffrey attended despite still managing his heart condition, saying he wouldn't miss celebrating 2 people who'd survived his brother's worst impulses and built something genuine despite the interference. The absence of Richard was noticeable, but not mourned, a relief rather than a loss. Natalie said she'd made peace with having a father who was alive, but not part of her life, choosing her own well-being over obligation to someone who'd proven he couldn't respect boundaries. Richard sent a letter from the halfway house asking if we'd consider letting him attend the wedding. He said he'd completed extensive therapy during his incarceration and finally understood how profoundly he'd damaged his relationship with Natalie and violated my rights. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped to eventually rebuild some form of relationship with his daughter. Natalie read the letter, considered it for several days, and then wrote back saying she appreciated his growth, but wasn't ready for contact. She said maybe in a few years, when more healing had occurred, she'd reconsider, but the wedding was about celebrating our future, and she didn't want it overshadowed by his past actions. She said he could demonstrate his respect for her autonomy by accepting her boundary without argument. He didn't respond, which Natalie took as a positive sign that he might actually be learning. The long-term impact of Richard's interference affected my practice and professional relationships in ways I hadn't anticipated. Several colleagues knew about the surveillance and trial through media coverage, and I had to address questions about whether I'd done anything to warrant such extreme attention from my girlfriend's father. The cybersecurity violation meant I'd had to notify patients whose information might have been compromised through Lansing's spyware, which created liability concerns and forced uncomfortable conversations about privacy and trust. My malpractice insurance premiums increased because of the potential exposure. The hospital where I practiced required additional security training and audits to ensure no ongoing vulnerabilities. But there were unexpected positives, too. Speaking publicly about the surveillance and Richard's control tactics connected me with other people who'd experienced similar situations with controlling in-laws or partners who used technology to stalk and manipulate. I was invited to speak at a conference about digital privacy and domestic control, sharing my experience as a cautionary tale about how wealthy individuals could use surveillance tools to abuse people who threatened their sense of control. The conference led to consulting work with law enforcement on identifying patterns of stalking and surveillance in family law cases. I found purpose in helping others recognize and document the kind of behavior Richard had normalized until it escalated into criminal activity. Natalie channeled her experience into investigative writing about technology-enabled abuse and control in relationships. She wrote a series of articles for major publications about how surveillance tools marketed for legitimate purposes were being weaponized by controlling partners and family members. Her work influenced several states to strengthen their laws around stalking and unauthorized surveillance. She testified before legislative committees about the need for better protections against digital stalking and clearer consequences for people who violated privacy under the guise of concern or protection. The articles won awards and established her as an expert on the intersection of technology and domestic control, giving her trauma a productive outlet and meaningful impact. Jeffrey lived 6 more years after his surgery, longer than initial projections had predicted. He spent that time reconnecting with Eleanor and building a relationship with Natalie that had been impossible while Richard dominated family dynamics. He told me once that watching his brother's arrest and conviction had been both painful and liberating, forcing the family to finally acknowledge Richard's pattern of control and manipulation instead of making excuses or avoiding confrontation. He said he wished he'd spoken up years earlier about Richard's behavior, that maybe intervention could have happened before things escalated to criminal activity. I told him that Richard's choices were his own, and that family members couldn't be expected to predict when concerning behavior would cross into criminal action. Standing in the parking lot that night when Richard first cornered me with his manufactured evidence and threats, I'd felt trapped and powerless, certain that whatever choice I made would destroy something important. I'd never imagined the truth would be so much more complicated than his simple narrative of infidelity, or that revealing that truth would unravel so many other lies in his life. Richard had tried to destroy me to maintain control over his daughter, and instead had destroyed himself and the family structure he'd been so desperate to preserve. The surveillance that was supposed to prove I was unworthy had instead proved Richard's own criminal behavior and obsessive need for control. Natalie and I occasionally drive past the restaurant where Richard cornered me, and sometimes I'll think about that moment when he showed me the photos and delivered his ultimatum. I'll think about how close I came to walking away from her to preserve my career, how Richard had counted on me valuing professional success over personal relationships. He'd miscalculated catastrophically because he couldn't imagine someone prioritizing love and honesty over self-preservation. That miscalculation cost him everything while teaching me that the right choice isn't always the safe one, and that truth exposed has more power than threats in darkness. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.